Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Steve Seepersod coming to you from the campus of Binghamton University here in Binghamton. It's starting to look a lot more like that picture that we just had up here on the screen. And I've got the fleece on. It is a cool, beautiful day in Binghamton and certainly turning into a lovely fall once again. Great to be with you here virtually. Of course, we had homecoming weekend a couple of weeks ago and welcomed more than 1,000 alumni back to campus. Always great to have our friends come and visit us here in Binghamton. For today, it'll be just a virtual visit as we have me and a special guest that I'll introduce, or actually our featured speaker for this webinar coming up here. And pleased to welcome you to today's program called When You Come to a Fork in the Road, Take It. You can tell we watched that Yogi Berra documentary on Netflix not too long ago. Certainly that's a quote that he made famous, but certainly appropriate for a discussion about making pivots in your career. And so you come to a fork in the road after a certain amount of years. Which way are you going to go? And then how do you navigate those changes? And that's what today's webinar is meant to talk about. So this is just one part of what we do as far as lifelong learning through your Alumni Association, this Binghamton Learning Network webinar series. We have the Tier Talk speaker series, a virtual book club, lots of ways that you can plug into what we're doing here on campus. So I'll go ahead and put our website address up here on the screen. And of course, after the show, take a look at all the great stuff we offer. Binghamton.edu/alumni, Binghamton.edu/alumni. So many ways that you can be engaged here at the university, whether you're here in Binghamton, in New York City, anywhere in the world, doesn't really matter. Lots of ways that you can be connected to us. We hope you'll certainly take advantage of that. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we introduce the featured speaker for this webinar. We want this program to be interactive and we want to take your questions. It's not one of these, let's save them to the end kind of things. We like to mix these in during the program so it keeps things interesting. It's more than just me, more than just the speaker. And so it gives a little bit of a different energy. If we have these questions coming in midstream, send those in. You can go ahead and email that to me and I'll put this address back on the screen here and there during the program. So if you don't get it down right now, not a big deal. If you're watching on Facebook, go ahead and type your question in as a comment. And if you're watching on the microsite, there should be a space for you to do just that. Send the questions in as you think of stuff and send in more than one question. And certainly this is a topic that we know people have a high amount of interest in as you try to navigate your career and making a transition to another field that you may feel passionate about. Can be a challenge in trying to package yourself, position yourself the right way. What are the skills that you should be working on? Who should you reach out to? These are all questions that we're going to go ahead and answer here today. And so only appropriate at this point that I bring in our featured speaker for this webinar, Mike Heaney from the class of 1987. He is the Director of Corporate Engagement and an adjunct professor at Boston College. Michael, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for joining us. Great to have you with us.
Steve, thank you. It's my pleasure. It's so much fun to obviously connect with my alma mater and, to be doing it in a place that in a very real way, I never could have imagined I would be at, all those years ago to be talking to you from my office at Boston College. If you had told me this when I graduated in 87, it's just not something I would have seen myself doing or talking about. And so it's so much fun to be here, and it's so much fun to talk about this story and hopefully maybe answer some questions for folks that are thinking about kind of making a life and career pivot. But let me give a little bit of background, and then I'll sort of tell you the story of exactly when and how, I took that fork. I took that literal fork in the road. So after graduating from Binghamton in 87, my first job out of college was working for a trade association, the Direct Marketing Association in New York City. So, that was my foundation, and it connected me with the direct marketing world, where I would spend the next 25 years as a marketing and sales guy, and loved it. Enjoyed my career, enjoyed what I did, had a lot of great mentors, enjoyed the world I was in. But after, decades of doing it, you start to think, maybe what's next? Maybe there's, a second chapter in my professional life. And at the same time, what was happening was I spent about 20 years coaching. I spent 15 years coaching high school basketball in New Hampshire, where I lived. And then eventually I made the move to start coaching in college. That was a passion of mine. It was a dream come true. But I was coaching at Southern New Hampshire University and starting to spend a lot of time around young people. and a lot of time on a college campus and starting to do some mentoring and some academic advising, and started to really think, I wish there was a way for me to find a path to do that full time. But it was so different than a life in, marketing and sales consulting. And how do you make that pivot? Who am I to think that I can do that? And as those questions are running through my mind, here's how it happens. And it's always kind of fun for me to talk about it, because when I got this job here at Boston College, so many people I knew wanted to know, how did you do it? How did you make this complete life and professional change at that point in your life? I was 58 years old when I arrived here. And it doesn't happen very often in life, but for me, I knew the exact moment when it sort of changed for me. And when I knew I was destined to do something else. I was it sounds kind of funny, but I was literally running on a treadmill. I was on a treadmill New Year's Eve of 2021. And my kids had just started getting me interested in podcasts. And I'm listening to a podcast as I'm running, and it was a series of motivational talks, motivational speeches. And one of the speeches that I was listening to at the moment was by the actor and activist and director Common. And he was sort of giving this message that if you're not exactly where you want to be and you're not doing exactly what you want to do, what are you doing about it? How do you begin to think about what are you going to do next? And I wasn't unhappy, but I kept listening to that message. I kept stopping the podcast, rewinding it a bit, and letting those words sink in a little bit. If you're not where you are and you're not doing what you want to do, what are you doing about it? So I stopped running, and here I am New Year's Eve. I'm running so that I can sort of earn the right to, have a great dinner that night. But I got off the treadmill and I stopped and I listened to the whole speech that he gave. And it was really a series of questions. And it was sort of, what are you willing to do? What are the bridges you're willing to cross? What are the gaps between where you are and where you want to be? And how do you start to fill them? How do you start to close that gap, cross those bridges, and get to where you want to be? So I really thought about it for a while, and I thought, okay, I really want to find a way to get to work on a college campus full time. I've never taught. I don't have any experience in higher education. So how am I going to do that? And living in New Hampshire at the time, I thought, okay, if I'm going to get into higher ed, I'm in a place where I can do that and commute to Boston. If I'm going to work in higher education, I'm going to do it in Boston, and I'm going to work for a national level brand, whether that's Boston College, where I am now, is it Harvard, is it MIT? I'm going to go to a place where when I say where I work, everybody knows what that means. But that's a big leap. That's a big goal, having never worked in higher education. So I literally started searching on LinkedIn and other job boards, what might be the opportunities on a college campus that call for a background in marketing and sales. And it was hard. I mean, there wasn't a job that seemed to fit. And I was sending out literally dozens of resumes. I think at one point I was north of 50 resumes, in 6 months, all over New England, any sort of job that was related to higher education, even at sort of the prep school level. But how could I trade off on the life and the career I'd built and start to figure out something I wanted to do? And I also knew what that meant was I was probably going to take, a salary adjustment potentially. I was going to be driving some really long commutes to work in Boston and drive back to New Hampshire. But that question kept coming back to me of, if I want to do something different, what am I willing to do about it? And those questions kept coming in my mind. Okay, I'm going to have to maybe have a long commute. I may have to think about, at the time I was a senior vice president of sales. I'm not going to walk into higher education, an entirely new world, in that senior position. I was going to have to accept a total title change and role responsibility change. And was I okay with that? And I was. So I really started spending so much time online, and not even in job boards, just trying to cobble together an idea. And I would wordsmith. I would say marketing, sales, and coaching, marketing, sales, and mentoring, marketing and sales and young people and education, and just kept playing with concepts. And then I got really, really lucky. I found this job posting for the director of corporate engagement at Woods College. Woods is one of the schools under the BC umbrella. And they created a brand new role. The job I'm in never existed before. And they were looking for somebody who had come from corporate America, who could help them connect with the business community in Boston and create opportunities for those companies' employees to go back to school. So that was my job, was to start building relationships with employers in and around Boston and talk about and tell our story, talk about Woods College and talk about how people can finish degrees, start degrees. And so it's a little bit of brand building, it's a little bit of PR, it's a little bit of sales, and it's in a higher education environment. And it's incredible. You know, I'm working my dream job. I'm working in an incredible place. I love who we are and what we do. And I often think about that New Year's Eve, and I think about that podcast, and I think about what are the bridges you're willing to cross? What are the sacrifices you're willing to make to get where you want to be? And it's hard. It's really hard. The first 6 months were really tricky. I felt like, very much a fish out of water. I went through imposter syndrome. I went through all those things people talk about. So you really have to be kind to yourself in those early days, early weeks, because it's going to be really tricky. I'm starting my third year now, and it's just starting to feel, comfortable and at home. And, maybe before we think about a question from our audience or from you, Steve, I'll share one more part of my story that is pretty cool. 3 months after I came here for a corporate relationship job. And 3 months after I get here, the dean I worked for at the time walks into my office, plops herself down and said, how are you doing? Are you settling in? And I said, yeah, I'm figuring it out. It's, sharp learning curve, but I'm settling in. And she said, great, we're going to throw a new curveball at you. We'd like you to think about teaching. Have you ever thought about teaching yourself? And I always loved the idea of maybe finding my way to a classroom, but I didn't know how that would look. And in the interest of full transparency, I was not the best student as an undergrad. School was a means to an end and nothing more. So I never thought about how I would someday be a teacher, much less teach at a place like Boston College. But I teach an undergraduate class called Designing Your Career. And it's based on an amazing book called Designing Your Life. And anybody who's here today, joining this call, that's a book you should check out right as soon as you can. Literally this weekend, go out and buy a book called Designing Your Life, because it changed mine. It put me in a classroom, and teaching is now a huge part of who I am. And again, you never saw that coming. So you take a risk, you pivot in your career, and your next thing you know, part of your career is something you never, ever could have seen coming. And I love it. I have class later today, and, I can't wait to get there. So a lot of good things have happened in a very short time here. I got very lucky, but it also took a lot of work. So I'll catch my breath there for a moment and see if maybe we have a question from the audience.
I'll go ahead and jump in. It seems like a good place to take a little bit of a breather, take a sip of water. And we don't have any audience questions yet at this point, but that certainly will change. But I jotted down a few, and I'll get to one of them here to get us started. And so
Perfect.
Looking at things at the front end of the process and somebody that's about to embark on making a career change, do you think it's more internal or external factors that could hold somebody back from getting started? And so externally, they may say, well, I may have to relocate to find a better opportunity, or I'm pretty topped out as far as income, and I'm going to be probably facing a pay cut, and I don't know if I am willing or able to deal with that. Or if it's more of an internal type thing of, I'm kind of afraid to make a move, or if I'm making a move from this position, it's kind of me admitting to myself, this is not really working out.
Right. No, Steve, such good questions. And I think the answer is all of the above, because you touched on a lot of things that I went through. If this was something I wanted to do 10 years earlier, I would have been in a situation where, my kids were younger, my bills were different. We were still getting ready to put our kids through college. I could not have thought about a pay adjustment. It would have been hard for me to think about, possibly a 2-hour commute in each direction. That would have been really challenging. So your place in life definitely matters. Again, as I said, I was 58 years old when I arrived at BC. Very different place for me to answer some of those questions. I talked about it a lot with the people I trust, my inner circle, my best friends, my wife, my family. Like, does this make sense? Is this something I should be thinking about? So I sounded it out a lot with the people I trust and, consider part of my inner circle. Um, you know, that willingness to sort of look at yourself and say, am I doing this because I'm not as successful as I want to be? Or, you know, that was a very interesting thing for me because I felt great about my career. I felt good about where I was, but I knew it just wasn't my calling. I knew there was another professional chapter for me. So that was a big part. There's a little bit of an ego swallow to it. I knew I was going to enter a world where, it was all new for me. I was very much in the deep end of the pool, and that's hard to accept when you've spent, the better part of your adult life building, and establishing a reputation. The industry I worked in, the direct marketing industry, I was fairly well known. I mean, I worked with a lot of the same people for a lot of years. I had great clients I'd worked with for years. People knew me. Now I come into a world where I am very much the new kid on the block. So there's an ego check. There's some fear. My first couple months, there were days I drove home, headed north from BC back to New Hampshire, where I would shake my head and think, man, I may have made a big mistake. I may have really gotten this wrong. And that's hard. That's hard to be able to look at yourself and go, did I screw this up? And there were nights when I thought, geez, if I call the CEO I worked for, is there any chance I get my old job back? And maybe not. So I've got to take a deep breath and, regroup and really commit myself to this new life I jumped into. So those are all really good questions. They are human nature questions. And I guess maybe what I kept trying to rely on was trust myself a little bit. There's a reason why BC hired me. They saw something that probably I didn't even see myself. And lean on that a little bit, lean on a little bit of later in life experience and maturity. And, all of a sudden, 6 months in, I found my groove. I got our first couple partners signed. I started teaching. I spent some time with my colleagues who I really, really enjoy working with. And all of a sudden, you take a deep breath and go, okay, still a steep learning curve, but there's no question I made the right decision. So yeah, I hope that speaks to most of what you brought up, Steve.
It's such an emotional thing, and it's really, to me, the way, just hearing all of this and reflecting on my own experience and that of other people I've talked to, it seems very much like a relationship like any other, and the difficult conversations you have internally when that relationship's not working out. It could be a relationship with a person, so a relationship with a spouse or a friend. When that's not working out, is going to have some of the similar feelings of this relationship to myself in the career, where I'm not getting what I want, or I feel it could be more. And what is that more going to be?
Correct.
And you have some soul searching around that to try to get yourself into a good place. And it's ultimately a positive thing when it happens, even though it's a little bit of a pain in the short run.
Absolutely, absolutely, Steve. And just a quick follow up to that. One of the things I struggled with was, I think I mentioned it. I was at the point where I'd sent out dozens of resumes, and for jobs I was eminently qualified for, and wasn't hearing anything back because I didn't have some of the background and skill sets they wanted. Even though I felt great about my experience, I had not been in an academic environment, so I wasn't checking some job application boxes. That's a big ego check. That's a really big ego check. And you have to. I took breaks from it a couple of times and said, okay, no more resumes for a couple of weeks. It's wounding my pride too much. But then you take a deep breath and go, okay, if I'm not looking for a job, I'm certainly not going to find a new job. So that's a balance you have to keep going back and forth on. Is okay, if I really want to do this, no ego involved. I have to keep grinding.
It reminded me of sitting across the table from someone who said, I don't think you're ever going to find a job ever in television news, which was a hard thing to hear as a 20-something person and having your education and internships and everything aligned in that direction. But
Right.
as
Clearly.
hard as that was to hear, it gave me an idea of what to focus on and made me just mad enough to want to try harder. And I think that needs to be part of the equation too sometimes.
I agree. No, you have to get a little bit angry at sort of the naysayers, whether it's in your own mind or actually people who are naysayers, and prove them wrong. I worked for CEO early in my career, and I apologized to him one day. We were arguing, and I said, forgive me, I have a bit of an ego. And he said, Mike, how many successful people do you know who don't have an ego? And so I think it's okay to, almost argue with yourself sometimes about the process, about, okay, if they're not going to interview me, that's their loss. That's hard to get to, but it's definitely important to keep your morale up for sure.
And I'm happy to share that we're starting to get some audience questions, so I'll go ahead
Awesome.
and roll into them. Here's the
Awesome.
first one. Can you speak more about your experience with imposter syndrome? Any advice for someone going through something similar?
I am so glad that somebody brought that up, Steve. It's such an interesting part of this whole experience of changing careers. And I use the term all the time. I struggled with it when I first got here because, one of the really interesting things about working at Boston College is most of the folks I work with are PhDs. Many of them are PhDs, and they're brilliant, and they are world-renowned leaders in what they do, and they've been doing this for a long time. And when I first got here, I would sit in the room and think, "Holy, like, what am I doing here? How do I, participate in a conversation in a conference room? And how do I disagree with one of my colleagues who has, multiple PhDs?" And in fact, one of my favorite jokes when I first got here was, the chat group I have with some of my friends, family, and so on. I wanted to change the name of the chat group to, I work with PhDs, but I don't have one. Because anytime somebody would ask about my early experience here, I had a major case of imposter syndrome. But then I read a really cool article, and I wish I could remember the magazine, but it was an entire article about the concept of imposter syndrome that changed my thinking about it. And in a nutshell, it said the only reason you have imposter syndrome is because you care deeply about what you're doing. Because if it didn't matter, if it wasn't important to you, you wouldn't suffer from imposter syndrome. It wouldn't matter to you what the people in the room thought if you didn't care about your ability to do the job and to be part of the team you're on and to sort of measure up to the other people in the room. If you care deeply about it, you're going to go through imposter syndrome. And now, 2 years into it, what I think about a lot is, I have skill sets, I have experiences, I have perspective that other people in the room don't have. I worked for a half dozen, corporations before I got here. A lot of different types of experiences, a lot of different work environments. Worked with, a handful of really, really talented CEOs, and those were experiences many of my colleagues do not have. They've spent their career in higher ed. So that's what helped me. It helped me to, at the end of the day, sort of drive home and think, I was out of my depth in that meeting, and then to, sort of challenge myself and say, you know what, not really. You didn't take the opportunity to speak up, share your thoughts, share your ideas because you come from a place that they don't. And that completely changed my approach to it. So I don't go through that anymore. I mean, and as a professor, I probably still do. I'm in front of really, really talented students, some of the brightest kids in the country here at BC. So I stand in front of them as a professor sometimes, and I do sort of laugh and think, what in the world am I doing here? But at the same time, I'm a little older, a little more mature, have had successful stops in my career, and I'm trying to help them get to some of the things that I do. And it's changed. I'll always have that a little bit as an educator, a little bit. Am I doing a good enough job as a professor? Hopefully, maybe a couple more years that'll be a lot less, part of how I think about it. But that idea of imposter syndrome, if it and again, this goes back to my role as a professor. The only reason I have it is because I care deeply about it. I want to be really good at it. I want to impact the students. I want to be part of their experience here at BC. If I didn't care about that, I wouldn't have imposter syndrome. So if you have it, if you're starting a new career or you're worried about that when you do, let that be something you embrace because it means you care about where you are and what you do.
I love the sentiment behind that because if you keep it other focused, say, I really want to make an impact, then it's less about you. And so it's not so much, am I qualified to do this? Am I in the right place? It's like, I really want to make a difference. And that's why I'm here. That's important.
100%. Exactly right, Steve. Yeah. As soon as I read that article, it completely changed my outlook on it. It made me realize this is a good thing. I made a career pivot for a choice. I wanted to challenge myself, and I'm doing that every single day. So let imposter syndrome be a positive.
We've got more audience questions, and from our side, that's great. Definitely keep the questions coming. We didn't have a super formal presentation plan. There's no slide deck. So send in the questions. These are absolutely not an interruption, so we can go in any order and cover the concepts. And we'd rather have it answering the things that you really want, because it's meant to help you. It's not just for our, I mean, this is fun. I have fun doing this. I know Mike does, but it's not for us.
Sure.
It's for you. So here's the next question. Noting your experiences now as a teacher, how are you feeling? How are you feeding your personal need for guidance and mentorship when you were younger into your students today?
Steve, read that to me one more time. I want to hear it one more time.
Sure. Noting your experiences as a teacher, how are you feeding your personal need for guidance and mentorship when you were younger into your students today?
Such a great question. And the best way to answer it is what I just did for an hour before I jumped into our conversation today. Was I was meeting with one of my students. And one of the things I've talked about with all my students is, and I think this is true in any walk of professional life as well, is one of my favorite things about teaching is that I never really had that connection with a professor when I was a student. But later in life now, I sort of look back and realize a lot of that was my fault and my responsibility, that I didn't look for those connections. I didn't reach out to a professor and say, "Hey, can I come pick your brain about your career? I need some help in this class. Can I just meet you for coffee and and talk about life and so on?" So looking back now, I realize, as I've always said, I wish I had that connection, but I also realize I didn't ask for it. And probably a lot of people on the call today go through a similar experience professionally, that we really crave those mentorship relationships, but how much do we do to bring them into our life? So yeah, to sort of go back to the question, it's one of my favorite things about teaching now is trying to be that for young people, trying to talk about my life was so far from a straight line. Again, Boston College, not even 30 years ago, 5 years ago, if somebody would have told me I'm working and teaching at BC, I would have laughed like, what are you talking about? How in the world is that going to happen? And now I try to talk to my students about that is going to happen. If you have big dreams, you need to chase them, but it's going to take steps probably. Your first job out of college won't be your dream job in all likelihood. The class I teach, Designing Your Career, is based on this book called Designing Your Life. One of the things that jumped out at me when I first read the book, and it's so relevant for today's conversation, is the average American will work for 10 employers in their career. And when I first read it, I thought 10 sounds like a lot. My wife is one of those really unique people who's had two employers in her 30 plus year career. But the average American will work for 10 employers. And what was so neat for me is when I arrived at BC was my ninth employer. And after relocating to Cape Cod last year, I changed where I was coaching. At the time, I was coaching at Southern New Hampshire University. That was going to be too tough of a commute. So I reached out to the staff at UMass Dartmouth, halfway between BC and Cape Cod, and started coaching at UMass Dartmouth. And when I signed my employment agreement at UMass Dartmouth, yes, it's a part-time employer, but they were my 10th employer. I tracked exactly to the book. So one of the things I think about now with my students, I talk about this with younger friends and family, that it's going to be very, very rare and unusual for your life to follow a straight line, for your career to follow a straight line, and to kind of embrace that all of your varied experiences probably eventually point you to where you were always supposed to be. And that's how I feel about BC. It took me a long time to get here. It was a stressful process, to try to make a career and life pivot. But I look around this campus every day and I think I'm exactly where I was supposed to be. So hopefully that's what I'm trying to impart into my students for sure.
Now, in thinking about what somebody would encounter in trying to make a career change, should they prepare themselves at the outset for this to take longer than, say, if they're looking for a position in their current field? Because now they've got to project a whole different persona and match up to something that it's not quite as organic as, say, I'm in sales, I'm going to another sales job. So not as much to think about there.
Could not, yeah, absolutely true, Steve. And I think that's one of the things I probably didn't think about early enough is, as soon as these thoughts are crossing your mind, like maybe it's time for a change, maybe I need to do something different, or not even need, just want to do something different. I think you start working on it just slowly, right there, step by step right there. So for me, that meant going back to my resume and trying to bring out the pieces of my past experience that might make sense. And as soon as I did that, one of the first things I thought about was, I was I was an assistant coach for women's basketball at Southern New Hampshire University. But part of my role beyond basketball was I was doing academic advising for our freshmen. I'm a dad. I have 3 kids. As Steve mentioned, my oldest is a Binghamton grad too. So the head coach I worked for thought the freshman would be a perfect role for me to try to, talk to our players about adjusting to college and being kind to themselves and all those things. But also, I realized there was a part of my professional experience, my experience as a coach, that definitely was relevant for higher education, that I had done academic advising, had helped young people think about how to be successful in college. I needed to pump that up in my resume and talk a little bit, or not talk about, write about what that meant, what the work I was doing, some of almost like a case study of how I was helping students adjust to college life. And I moved it up in my experience prominently in my resume. I mentioned it in cover letters. So I started looking for nuggets that were going to be relevant to higher ed as soon as that thought crossed my mind. So maybe the best answer to that is, it's okay to have multiple versions of your resume. And I would always have 2 or 3 versions of a cover letter that maybe speak to different parts of the world you might want to get into. And I'll give you an example. A job that I got close to that I actually thought I was going to get offered to take was at Harvard Law School. But the job at Harvard Law School was very much still in the direct marketing world. It was going to be database analytics, database marketing from an internal setting, doing it for Harvard Law. So it was going to match, my prior skill sets almost identically, which actually wasn't something I wanted, but it was going to let me do it in a higher ed world. So that seemed like an interesting job. So I had to talk about my direct marketing strengths prominently there and a little bit of higher ed. But the resume and the cover letter that got me here to BC, what my coaching life was much more prominently featured. So multiple resumes, multiple cover letters, I think is good to start working on. As soon as you have any thoughts, even if it's a year from now, 2 years from now, you want to make a career pivot, start thinking about the logistical part of it, which obviously is a resume and a cover letter.
And you and I have seen this as both the applicant and being on hiring committees, in particular higher ed, can be very, very tough if you're not already in higher ed to be seen as someone that would be a good fit in the position.
Could not agree more. One of the interesting things for me was the final round of my job interview here was a selection committee of PhDs. They had all grown up entirely in higher ed. And here I am coming with no higher ed background, and I've got to make the case for why me. And that's another part of this process that I think is really interesting is if you're going to make a career pivot, you've got to think about the strengths that you bring into a room or the skill sets that you bring into a room that maybe don't exist yet. And the thing I thought about was I spent most of my adult life having people say no. They didn't want to have a meeting. They didn't want to entertain a new consultant. They didn't want the contract I was offering. And the ability to hear lots of no's to eventually get to yes was not something anybody in the selection committee had experience with. So I had to talk about that as a real strength and a positive and something I wasn't afraid to do in my role at BC. So those are really good things to think about too. If you're going to go into a world where maybe you don't have the exact job experience, how do you take what you've done and make it a strength that maybe the other people in the room don't have?
Go back to the viewer questions. This one is a little bit of a long one. It's kind of a lot here, and it's a comment and a question together, but we'll go ahead and dive in. I was let go after 19 years at my job as a senior director. I am a social worker doing national consulting under restructurings. This was the person being let go was because of restructuring. I was 62. Others were let go before me, including my boss. They were even older. I knew it was age discrimination, and the HR director said, "You are making too much compared to others." I considered suing, but it was March 2020 in the height of COVID. I stayed home on unemployment and took care of health issues. Now I wonder how I can find something at 66. Any ideas? I love the idea of teaching and have training experience and taught a higher ed course online. Love the idea of working more with mentoring and teaching, just concerned about the age issues.
That's a great question, and I'm so glad it came up because, and this is sort of relevant well beyond that question, but hopefully I'll answer the question at the same time. One of the things I went through, one of the things I was really stressed out about as I was looking to make a career pivot was, had I aged out? I was applying, I think I mentioned earlier, I was applying to jobs that I thought I was eminently qualified for, had perfect background for, even though I was trying to get to higher ed. The skill sets that I saw in a job description, I thought I had, aced, and I wasn't getting interviews. I wasn't getting calls, and it's maddening. It can be a huge blow to your ego. And I had some of those same thoughts. I thought, man, am I doing this too late? Have I aged out? And that is definitely terrifying. And I think maybe the way to look at it, maybe the way to answer that question is sort of what happened to me, in a way, by accident. It was taking a much my job title is not, it's not significantly lesser within the world of higher ed, but in the marketing and sales world, yes, I traded this very high level senior vice president. I was at the officer group level, in two of my past stops in my career, and now I'm coming in very much at a mid. In higher ed, a director is mid management. And in fact, last year it was actually kind of neat. I was put into a year-long training program for next generation managers, basically to develop and identify the future generation of leaders at BC. And here I am, at that point I was 59, almost 60, and I'm in a mid-manager, identification program, which was, flattering and funny at the same time. I won't be here long enough probably to get to the senior level. But to sort of answer that question, maybe that's something to think about. Is Yeah, that age question is a big one, and it's a good one. But hopefully what you can capitalize on is all that great experience applying at a mid-level or even junior level job. You might send that out to 20 people who don't want to give it a chance to somebody your age, but then you're going to get to the right one. And that's what happened with me and the dean who hired me. From what I learned later in the process, that I came into the process at the end. I was very much late to the process, and the dean hadn't found exactly what she was looking for. So she was able to look past the fact that, yeah, I'm doing this later in life. She wanted somebody with the experience, and one of the first things we talked about was, do you realize you're willing to give up this very senior level career you've built to come in at the mid level? And I was. I needed somebody to take a chance, and I hope that sort of addresses that question of, there's a little bit of right time, right place, no doubt, but you have to be willing to accept that as well, to get a foot in the door and then reestablish yourself. And um, that certainly was a little bit of an early ego check, but it worked out really well. So yeah, I went through the age discrimination question in a big way, but it was a little bit of right time, right place, and somebody willing to give me a chance.
In your case, you knew you wanted to go from sales to working in higher ed, and for others, maybe it's not so clear what the next step is. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what sort of mental homework, for lack of a better way to say it, you would recommend for someone that wants to move, but they're not sure what they want to go to. And many times, if it's driven by, this isn't really working out, I hate it, and you run away from something, a thing that you jump into, it's almost like the equivalent of, you divorce your spouse and then you marry somebody that is basically the same. You say, how did I do it again?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, and here's, I'm glad you brought that up. And here's maybe a story that'll address that. It's one of my favorite stories since I got here. So when I started teaching, again, I'm teaching this class called Designing a Career, and a lot of it is how to figure out the match between what you want to do and who you are. And that's a long process. That's not an easy thing to do at any point in life, to try to find that ideal spot. And here's one of my favorite stories. So my first semester teaching, I had a Boston police officer in my class. And one day we were talking after class, and she's got an incredibly stressful job. She's a hostage negotiator. And somewhere in our conversation, she said what she does to relax is woodworking. She makes furniture sets, tables and chairs, but she was telling me how she doesn't get time to do it anymore because her job is so stressful and she's so tired and so on. And I sort of said, Vanessa, you think about the gift you have, that you have this passion for another career, making woodwork, something most people can't do. You have to make time for it. And guess what? If you start making time for it, and just little by little start to build up a little bit of a portfolio. Maybe you start to do that a little bit on the weekend and build a website, and next thing you know, you're an entrepreneur selling some of your furniture. And lo and behold, I run into her 6 months later at a coffee bar on the Cape, and she's doing exactly that. She's got a website and she's selling some of her woodworking, and she's thinking, wow, I might do this someday. I might do this for real full time. And I share that story with my students all the time. So many of them, they are determined to be an accountant. They're determined to be a lawyer, whatever that might be, an engineer, but they love music and they don't know how to make music part of their life. And I will tease them and say, what if you grab your guitar and on a Saturday go to Boston Commons and just start playing for the public? Just give a little bit of a free concert. And all of a sudden, you're starting to make part of what you're passionate about, part of what brings you joy. You're making that part of your life. And yes, that's really hard in a professional context. But I go back to what happened to me with coaching. I'm passionate about basketball, coaching the game, teaching the game. So by making that part of my life, I start coaching in high school. And then high school leads to college. And coaching in college allowed me to get my master's because Southern New Hampshire paid for it. Probably wouldn't have gone back to school if my employer didn't, pay my tuition, but they were. All of a sudden, I've got my master's, and having my master's allows me to apply for a job at BC. So I think when you can figure out some of the things that you really, really enjoy, you can start to make them part of your life on a part-time basis. And the next thing you know, it puts you on a path to doing it full-time. So the whole thing is such a process and a journey.
And probably equally important to know, what don't I like? What do I hate doing? What takes energy away from me? Because that's exactly what I'd want to move away from into the next thing, instead of, here I am in this job that I thought was gonna be great and I felt good in the beginning, and then I hate this as much as the thing I left.
Could not agree more, Steve. It's one of the things I talk about with my students. You have to. We do a thing in my class called the Good Time Journal, and it's keeping track of your life for a week and the things that bring joy into your life, the things that distract from your life, and how do you do more of the good and less of the bad. And it's not as rainbow, feel good as it sounds. It's a really cool exercise because we all have things we have to do. The students have to go to class. I have to come to my office and do my job. But are there ways that you can start to think about, the things that take joy out of your life? And if there's a way to do a little bit less of them, do a little bit less. Are there things that you love to do? Can you find a way to do a little bit more of that? And sometimes it's as simple as one more hour of the good and one less hour of the bad. And I think when people start to think about that, the parts of your professional life you really don't want. You don't want to be in committee meetings all day. You don't want to look at spreadsheets all day. Then that's part of your job seeking process. You have to start looking at careers that'll let you do less of that, or maybe absolutely none of it. And you love mentoring and counseling, start volunteering at a boys and girls club, start volunteering, in a youth soccer program. Find ways to start building little lines on your resume that 5 years from now maybe become a big part of a story you tell in an interview. So it's a process and you have to create it for yourself. But that, what do I want to do less of? What do I want to do more of? That's a huge part of it.
Just interesting to think about, how people say they want to go into management because they just feel like that's just a natural track upward, only to find that they don't like supervising staff and they don't like issues management. And
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
but that's part of the game. That is the game.
It is. And the other thing I tell my students too, Steve, is there are going to be parts of your life and parts of your career where, what, the job isn't great. The job is not ideal, but right now I have to pay my mortgage. I have to get my kids through school. I have bills to pay like we all have. And to take a deep breath and be okay with that, as long as you are finding some of that time to do the things that light you up, that make you feel good and make you smile. And that it might only be an hour a week in your 20s. It's 5 hours a week in your 30s. It's 10 hours a week in your 40s. But to me, it's a huge part of your happiness factor that I figured out a little bit later in life. I was pretty caught up like most people in, late 30s, early 40s, paying the bills. That's completely okay. We all have to do it. But if you start looking at the things that light you up and find ways to make them part of your life, you just might find a way to make them part of your career. And I'm a big advocate of it because it happened to me.
These are great stories, especially the one about the student who now is doing woodworking, and just
It's
thinking how
incredible.
much happier is that person just waking up every day and going to do the thing they love versus putting on the uniform. And being a police officer is certainly an important job, but if you hate it, you know, it's just, I
Exactly.
couldn't imagine how difficult that is.
Exactly right. Exactly right, Steve.
Got another audience question.
Right.
Can you share the name of the New Year's Eve podcast that you mentioned earlier? And are there any other podcasts that you would recommend?
Yeah, it's so funny, Steve. I get asked that a lot, and I apologize that I don't remember the name of the podcast. Um, it's one of those things. I think I was searching for motivational speeches while I ran. It's sometimes I listen to music, sometimes I try to find inspiring messages when I run. So I don't remember the name of the podcast, but I think if you start Googling inspirational speech podcasts, you'll find something that speaks to you. There is one I really, really like. I try to listen to it every day as I drive up to campus. It's called Your World Within, and it's hosted by a guy named Eddie Pinero. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm pretty sure I am. Eddie Pinero, and the podcast is Your World Within, and he is just regular, for lack of a better word, just a regular guy who started this podcast to share his life story and what he's doing now. And a lot of it is just making you think about where you are and what you're doing, and are you taking the right steps to get where you want to be. And sometimes his messages are a kick in the butt, that you're not doing enough. Sometimes his messages are be good to yourself, let yourself accept the fact that you are working really hard to chase your dreams. And sometimes it's just his experience yesterday as he did his job or went for a run or all the things we do in life. So that's probably my favorite. If I was going to add one today, Your World Within is a podcast I would add.
And speaking of podcasts, we have a Binghamton Alumni podcast, which I may have mentioned in the opening. If not, I'll plug it later, but definitely worth checking out. And if you're going on a run or driving across town, it's always a good listen, but more on all of that later. And you mentioned a little bit earlier in the webinar that you had some deep conversations with people very close to you when you were thinking about making this move and in the very early part of the process. I was just wondering from your side, who you would recommend that people talk to if they should seek out a career coach, and if that's not something that's available to them because they can't find the person who they feel is appropriate, and many times it can be kind of expensive when the meter runs up on these coaching sessions, who should they seek out input from instead?
Really good question, because you know what? There are a lot of great career coaches out there, people who probably do an amazing job and charge accordingly. And God bless them. That's their right to do that. I don't know that you need that. I'm sure everybody on the conversation today, they have people in their life that can challenge them, encourage them, but also hold them a little bit accountable. And that's what I did with a couple of my closest friends. Was I'm a big advocate of putting out into the universe who you want to be and what you want to do, and not keeping your dreams a secret. I tell that to my students. I tell that to friends. Share that with everybody who's here today. Don't keep your dreams a secret. If there's something you want to do, somebody you want to be, start talking about it. Because I think I'm a big believer in manifesting. Doesn't matter how long it takes. If you put it out in the world, I like your chances of making it happen. So I talked to really smart, successful, friends who I trusted, former colleagues who I trusted, and a big part of that was, again, they'd hold me accountable to what are you doing about it? What have you changed about your resume? Who you're reaching out to? But then the other big part of it that was so helpful at that time was smart, successful people who I love and trust were telling me I was going to get there. It didn't matter if it wasn't happening at my pace. To keep plugging, I was going to get there. And when I talk about kind of my inner circle, they are lawyers, they're accountants, they're teachers, they're retired neighbors. Retired neighbor friend of mine who spent a career in the Air Force and in the defense industry, who would just say, you're not giving yourself enough credit. You're a bright, successful guy. If this is a place you want to get to, you're going to get there. So you need those messages. And I'm not sure sometimes a career coach can always do that, because they have a specific role, right? They're trying to help you get into a path. Sometimes you need those boosts, from the people in your life who just say, take a look in the mirror. You're fine. But at the same time say, hey, how many resumes did you send out this week? when's the last time you took an interview, even if you didn't want the job, just for interview experience? And that's advice I give all the time. And I'm glad I have a chance to mention it here. You should absolutely take interviews for jobs you're not even sure you want, because you need fresh experience for when you get that job interview that you really want. Don't let yourself go a year, where you haven't had an interview, and now you have to walk into your dream job and tell your life story. The more practice, the better. And it's also interesting when you're not really interested in that job, how much more relaxed and confident you are. You wind up doing a really good job interviewing. And sometimes you might be offered the job and actually say no, which is pretty empowering too. So tell your inner circle. If you want to hire a career coach, by all means. I'm not a big advocate that you need that. Reach out to smart, successful people and ask for their guidance and their words of wisdom.
We've got about 10 minutes or so left, and we'll certainly take audience questions right up until the end. And from our side here, just so people know, it's not a hard stop at 1 o'clock Eastern. We can go a little bit over, but I was just kind of curious, and we've had much of the time driven by questions, which is exactly what we wanted. So I think that's been great. Just from your side, are there any other major points that you want to make sure that we got to by the time that we signed off in about 10, 12 minutes or so?
I think we've covered most of the story from my perspective, Stephen, and the questions have been really, really fun. I think maybe a word of wisdom, if you will, at this moment is, if you spend some time on this call today, then start today. Go home tonight, go home this weekend, and look at your resume and how current is it. What are the skill sets that you're probably not giving yourself enough credit for? Have your spouse, friends, partners read your cover letter. I sent my cover letter to a bunch of people and asked them for their input, and they made it better. I'm lucky I have a couple friends from different stops in my life who are in recruiting. So they read my cover letter and my resume and gave me great feedback. And one of the things that maybe I haven't mentioned that I wanted to make sure I mentioned is every time I was frustrated in my career, with the job I had, with the people I was working for, the best thing I did for myself, for my mental health, was I sent a resume out. I found a job, even if it was, not really something that lit me up, but looked maybe interesting. Every time I send a resume out and a cover letter, I felt like I was in control of my destiny. It's one of the best pieces of career advice I could ever give. And I think it's relevant to this concept of life pivoting. I'll go back to that podcast. If you're not doing exactly what you want and if you're not exactly where you want to be, what are you doing about it? And it's not as hard as you think. Just write a cover letter, send out a resume, and I promise you're going to exhale and think, okay, I took a positive step today for me. This is not my end game. This is not my last career stop. I'm going to do something else. Every time I did that, I felt better.
If you send it out and you say, what's the worst that could happen? I don't get an answer back. It's definitely going to be a no if I don't do anything.
It's cliche, Steve, but you'll always miss 100% of the shots you don't take. I talk about that as a lot as a coach. If you're afraid to shoot it, you'll never know how good it feels to make the shot.
Exactly. We got it from Yogi to Wayne Gretzky.
Exactly, from Yogi to Wayne Gretzky. Good for you knowing that's a Wayne Gretzky quote, Steve.
There's so many great Yogi quotes. My favorite one, I think, is why buy good luggage? You only use it when you travel.
That's a great
I
quote.
say that one a lot whenever we're going to go on a trip.
Who knew Yogi Berra was a philosopher, but he was.
That is great stuff. I was trying to think of the question I was going to ask, and it flew out of my head because I got so focused on the quotes, but those are fun too. Well, I'll come back to it, but it's probably time for another good story or two. I'll just put up the email address on the screen one more time, just so we have a couple of minutes to take questions.
Great.
You talked about psychological homework. Oh, I remember the thing I was going to ask about is what would you say about volunteer opportunities and taking advantage of those? Because it seems to be like a great way to sort of like, it's not so much like focusing on the door being open, but it's like the window, and you can meet some new people, develop some skills, and find that sometimes that has a way of getting you to your next thing that, when you didn't really intend for that to happen.
Steve, perfect question. And I can give a great anecdote about that. And again, it goes back to one of my students. he, young guy, and his passion in life, the thing that lit him up was skateboarding. And we're talking one day, and he said, "But Mike, you keep telling us to find ways to do things that light us up. Well, my passion is skateboarding. How can that ever be part of my life, professionally?" And I said, "Okay, Josh, just go down to a park and watch some kids skateboarding and offer to give them lessons. Be a volunteer skateboarding coach. And that way you get to do some skateboarding, you get to do something really positive in your community, but you're going to start to build some skills too. You're going to start to build some teaching, mentoring, coaching, leadership skills. And it's going to light you up, and you're not going to realize it, but you're doing some professional development." So I would absolutely encourage anybody to volunteer at a Boys and Girls Club, at a YMCA, coach the sport that you played as a kid, and who knows who you meet. The other coach, the person who runs the league, the people who run the theater club. All of a sudden, they're connected to somebody in the world that you want to be in. So you're making more connections. But I'll go back to this kid Josh, who I convinced to start volunteering as a skateboard coach. The next thing you know, the parents who are in the park are watching him do this, and they're watching how good he is at it, and they start hiring him to give their kids lessons. Now he's making a side income. He's building a little line on his resume that he's an entrepreneur. He's building a business. He's building a brand in something, in a world that he loves and he's passionate about. And when we connected months later, he was so excited about it. Never would have thought of it. And yeah, he took a volunteer opportunity, made it part of his world, actually makes a couple bucks. But I promised him, in the right room, that's going to be a great interview story about how he built this little brand out of something that lights him up. Who wouldn't love hearing that in a job interview? So that it's such a good question. And it's how I started. My first coaching jobs were volunteering. And actually, the only reason I got a chance to coach at the college level was I offered to do it for free. It was something I loved. It was something I wanted to do. I told the head coach I didn't need a stipend. And what happens 3 months after she hired me, she was excited about the work I was doing, and she put me on a part-time salary. So I think if you're willing to put your neck out a little bit, good things tend to happen.
It's amazing thinking about all of the skill sets that we have, and some things we may not be necessarily immediately aware of because we haven't used particular skills in a while. But I'm somebody who's a compulsive list maker. So I always say, like, just write down everything that you've done. And
Exactly.
Stuff will come out that you've just kind of pushed to the back of your mind and forgotten about. Be like, oh, I did that. And it gets you to that fun part where all of these things get tied together and gets you into that opportunity you never thought was going to be possible. And I love when stories wrap up like that.
It's the only reason I'm here, Steve, is a collection of experiences and the willingness to talk about it and manifest it, and trust that we all have a great background, right? We all have a special alma mater. Binghamton prepared us well for life. Trust yourself that you're going to get where you want to be.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for making the time with us. And I know that you've been heavily involved with Binghamton for quite a while, head of our New Hampshire chapter back when that was really going prior to COVID, and have been just involved in career development in so many different ways. And so super generous of you to share your time and expertise with us. We really, really appreciate it.
I'm grateful for the invitation. I had a blast. I hope it was helpful, and I'll always be grateful for my years at Binghamton.
Thank you. And as promised, we'll go ahead, since we've got a little bit of time here just before the end of the hour. There's the slide for the Binghamton Alumni Podcast. So we've got some great content, and be actually publishing another episode of the podcast later on this week on Friday. And so these are short 15 to 20 or so minute interviews with alumni who are doing cool things out in the world. We're on Spotify. So go to Spotify, search Binghamton Alumni Podcast, and you'll find we're in our second season of this podcast. And it's certainly a lot of fun to put these together, driven by great Binghamton stories. And so check that out when you can. We have an alumni travel program. I'll go ahead and put the website address back up on the screen, binghamton.edu/alumni, right there from the homepage. You can see what we have going on. There are a lot of great trips planned for 2025, whether you want to stay here in the United States or travel overseas. the world is your oyster with this travel program. Trust me. So go ahead and check out that on the website. Sign up for one or more trips, whatever your time and money allow you to do. I guarantee you're going to have a phenomenal time. We'll take good care of you, and that's something that we're very, very happy to offer you as part of the Alumni Association. Certainly many other things that we have as far as live in-person events in your area, and we travel around the country, New York City, Columbus, Ohio, other places like that. We've got virtual events like this webinar series and other great programs, ways that you can volunteer from anywhere in the world. And certainly Mike is a great example of a volunteer that's very active with us, and you could do the same. So all of that is there, binghamton.edu/alumni. So go ahead and wrap it up. For Mike Heaney, I'm Steve Seepersod. Thanks for joining us here on the webinar, and we'll see you next month.